man, there we go. All right. So I was walking down when I came in, and you can't really see it from here, but Luca is sitting there, and I can tell he's been sitting there the whole time, and he's got his little, I think it's a little tablet thing, and he looks like a little man just ready to study, and it's the cutest thing ever. And then you got Preston right here, who he looks at you like the whole time. It's like he's surprised by what's going on. So it's fun. It's wonderful seeing just all the young kids we have in this congregation. It's wonderful to see. So my title, my lesson for today is just called Simple. I don't know if it's going to be a simple sermon, but I just titled it Simple, and you'll see why here in a minute. But what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try and actually tell a story. I'm not very good at telling stories. I did not get that ability from my dad and my brother, the way they can tell stories and be really funny. I didn't get that gift, but not going to be a funny story, but I'm going to try anyway. So I guess it's almost like a Disney story because it's going to start out with a shipwreck. So, but I want you to imagine, if you will, that someone is shipwrecked, a young person, let's say, shipwrecked on an island. And this is a deserted island, and they're by themselves, and they're old enough that they can read and they can do things to take care of themselves, but they're young enough to where they really weren't introduced to anything for the most part in the real world. And on this island, he's shipwrecked, he learns to survive, and with him on that island that survives the wreckage is a Bible. And so for 30 years, this now man who grew up has been on this island by himself for 30 years. He gets rescued. We can turn it into a Jurassic Park story if we want to and say they were going to put dinosaurs on the island, whatever you want to do. But they find him on the island and he gets rescued. But this entire time he spent 30 years reading the Bible every single day. Going through the Old Testament, going through the New Testament. As you can imagine, that's a lot of reading of the Bible. Maybe something we should do more often. So when he gets rescued, they bring him back. And probably one of the first things he's going to do is eat some real food and take a shower, hot one, shave, clean up. But after that, the thing he's probably going to want to do is go to the Christians and see the church that he's been reading about in this Bible for 30 years. So my question is, what's he going to find? Is he going to find the church that we find in the Bible? What he's read about for 30 years in the New Testament, when he walks into, and I'll say for the American church for the most part, what's he going to find? Is he going to find a New Testament church like we see with devoted followers, with the supernatural love of Jesus, who are making disciples, are filled with the Spirit, and are suffering and sacrificing for the cause of Christ? Or is he going to find the consumeristic church that's focused on what's in it for me, where the supernatural love of Christ is barely seen, if at all, where making disciples is the preacher's or pastor's job, depending on where you're at, where only 2% of the church is even trying to make disciples? And the first mention of suffering or some sacrifice causes about 80% of the church to flee, hide, or be preoccupied. So think about that story for a minute. And imagine that you had no introduction to the church that you see today. And that all you had was the Bible. And that was your introduction for 30 years. And you walked into many of the churches, or I say any of the churches you see today. What would your reaction be? Think about that for a second. Then, my question would be, think about your reaction, what it would be. Is it the church that we see in the New Testament? What would you do about it? And I propose three options, I think, for most people if they walked into this situation. A lot of them would say, well, man, these people are hypocrites, I'm leaving. They'd join them. Say, okay, well, this is just the way it is now, so let's do it this way. Or the third one, I think, that he would challenge them or try to change them a little bit and say, hey, why don't we try to get back to the church that we saw? I think anyone who spent a long time reading and studying the Bible would want to do that thing, try to get the church back to what it was, what we see the church as in the New Testament. So part of that story is then, how would that play out? I think it would play out in one of four ways. And I think you see this it kind of parallels with Jesus and his story and the story of the sower, the parable of the sower. And I think a lot of times it plays out this way in our churches today. If a person came and said, hey, I've been all alone for 30 years, and I don't know, this just seems a lot different than what I'm reading about in the New Testament. I think you have one group who would say, you're right. You make some good points. We kind of have lost it or drifted away from who we're supposed to be, the Christians that we're supposed to be. Let's work back towards getting there. And they would work and focus on those type of things. I think you'd have a second group that would say, yeah, we agree, follow along, say, well, man, you're working hard, you're doing good, we appreciate it, that's great. But for the most part, they're just going to do that. Just let you know that you're doing great. The third group really won't listen. All right? They'll acknowledge it and say, hey, yeah, that's right. But for the most part, they'll ignore them because they like the bubble that they've developed, the world that they grew up in. It's safe. It's comfortable. We don't want to come out of that. So we don't want to do anything that makes us pull ourselves out of our comfort zone. And then you're going to have a fourth group. And this fourth group's going to feel attacked. And they're going to not like the idea of some stranger or someone coming in and upsetting and challenging them and maybe looking at some of their traditions and their beliefs differently. And usually what you see is, that's the way they've always done things. So we don't, this is wrong. What does he know, right? I've heard this several times about people. They don't have a master's degree or a biblical degree in ministry, right? Or the Bible. He's just been alone on an island for 30 years, or he doesn't know what he's talking about. Or he hasn't been a leader or a deacon or an elder in the church like we have for so many years. He doesn't have the wisdom and maturity needed to be able to talk about these type of things or these changes. And so that fourth group, they dismiss him. They spread lies, try to discredit him. Others will say he's teaching unscriptural things. But for the most part, they talk about him behind his back and gather those who will be their echo chamber to do and limit him. Eventually, that person is going to grow tired of it, get discouraged, and either quit or go somewhere else. And you're probably wondering where I'm going with this and what this has to do with being simple. On a little bit of a side note, too, Dad did a class a few Wednesdays ago, about a month or two ago, and it was called The Rise of the Duns. And it talked about the leaders and the people we've had in the church who were active and just wonderful servants in the church, and then one day just walked away from it all. And I think, in a way, we missed the meaning of that article a little bit. Because we talked about, well, if they were truly committed, they wouldn't have walked away. Or if they were this, then if they were truly faithful, and I can say that's not the case. I've seen some reasons, and I understand why. And so, maybe sometimes we shouldn't be as hard on the ones who are done as we are sometimes the people in that fourth group. who make it hard to be a leader or a servant and would want to make someone walk away. So again, we'll get you at what in the world does this have to be with doing with simple? All right? Here's what it is. We've lost the simplicity of the gospel. And what I mean by that is, like the Pharisees, we have layered religion and Christianity in many ways with rules and programs and traditions. And then if anyone comes along and questions or says, hey, maybe there's a different way, or maybe there's something else we need to look at here, we attack them for challenging us. That's about how I put in my notes here. About the only thing is we haven't done yet is tried killing them, like the Pharisees did. Right? And so, as we look into this and we talk about the simplicity of the gospel, let's look at the church then versus the church now. And when I say church, I mean church as a whole. I'm not just talking about the Church of Christ or the Baptist church down the road or the non-denominational church. I'm talking about, and honestly, more of an Americanized church that we see. Look at how the church in the New Testament spent their resources and their energy. What were they focused on? What did they go to? What did they do? Look at that. Read through Acts. I mean, Acts is a perfect example. You know, all the books in the New Testament, but Acts especially. And look at the church now. Where does the church spend a lot of its time and a lot of its focus and a lot of its energy and a lot of its resources on? And I want to be honest with you, when you look at this and you ask this question and you study it, for me, it wasn't just stepping on my toes, it was a kick in the gut. Especially for me, because I'm the type of person, if you know me, and you know a lot of the things that I like to talk about and I like to push, you know, my thought, especially for many years, is, you know what? We need to have the best building. We need to have the best grounds. We need to have the best preacher with the best series that we advertise out there to everyone. We need to have the best singing, the best Sunday school programs, the best outreach events. Our VBSs need to be the best. Our trunk or treat needs to be the best. We need to make sure we get more people here every single year. Our guest services and follow-up program needs to be the best. Our website and social media, all that, our online streaming, we need to build all this new stuff, build new business, and it all needs to be the best, right? But think for a minute, all the time and all the resources that go into all of that. Now, Chad's not saying we need to get rid of all that. But what I'm saying is think about it. How much time do we put into all those where maybe sometimes we should be putting all that energy into just simple discipleship making? And some people say, well, these programs, and yes, they do. They help with some of that. But if you look at a lot of it, most of it is a consumeristic type focus. It's come out of things that's, what do we like? What do we want to see? Or what do they want to see? What do they want to see us do? So I'm not against these things. I'm not saying we need to stop doing all these things, still our building. What I'm saying is, have we lost our focus? And I think sometimes all that stuff that we do sometimes can cause us to lose our focus. And I've been a deacon for almost 15 years now here at the church. And what I'm about to say is not in any way a condemnation of our leadership, the past leadership and current leadership. It's just a point of perspective that I've noticed when I go back and when I was studying for this, and I've been studying on this for a little while. How many times in those 15 years do you think in our leadership meetings that we spent 30 minutes talking about how we should love better, like Christ. Have that supernatural Christ-like love. How many times do you think our spirituality, our devotion to Christ and His Word, and how we can increase that has come up? Or how about discipleships and making disciples and how we can do better at that? Or our suffering and our sacrifice for God? And I'm not going to list them all, but if you actually go back through and read most of our minutes, for the most part, we talk about things that aren't spiritually based at all. Like I said, I don't mean that as a knock, because I'm part of that problem. But if you look, we spend most of our time talking about things like sprinklers and flowers and doors and grass and bulletin boards. Building projects. Some of these things are important, and some of this stuff we need to talk about. And I'm not saying that we should be going into our leadership meetings and not talking about any of these things, right? We've got things that we have to take care of, and we have to talk about them some. But when we talk about more about this kind of stuff than we do the spirituality of the church, I think we've lost our focus. And I'll be honest, in some instances, you could take Lake Park Church of Christ off the top header of those notes, and it wouldn't look very much different than most businesses or organizations meetings that you would see. And I think we should be different than that. So the New Testament church, what was their focus? Compared to how we meet. How did they use their time, and how did they use their resources? They met in their homes. They shared what they had with each other. And they showed the supernatural love of Jesus to each other in the world. Now, we know they weren't perfect. We know that. We know they had their own problems. They had their own problems of losing focus, just like we're talking about. They tried to overcomplicate things. There are several times where Paul and some of the others had to write them and say, hey, you need to get back on track. Your focus needs to be Jesus. And I think sometimes we need to look at ourselves in that way and kind of go back and look at our where our focus is sometimes. And I'll put it this way. I like these two verses. 1 Corinthians 2, verses 1 through 5. Paul here is writing to the Corinthians. And he says, when I first came to you, dear brothers and sisters, I didn't use lofty words and impressive wisdom to tell you God's secret plan. For I decided that while I was with you, I would forget everything except Jesus Christ, the one who was crucified. I came to you in weakness, timid and trembling, and my message and my preaching were very plain. Rather than using clever and persuasive speeches, that word for some reason, I relied only on the power of the Holy Spirit. I did this so you would trust not in human wisdom, but in the power of God. Excuse me. I think sometimes we have the exact opposite approach of what Paul had here. And I'm guilty of this, and I'll admit it 100%. I think, sometimes I think I've said it before. Well, we need to be flashy. We need to be attractive. We need to do things. And again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But Paul here says, look, I just came to you simple, plain, and true. Right? I didn't use fancy words. I came to you in a plain form, and I used the power of God Himself to bring you to Christ. So I wonder sometimes if maybe we need to look at that a little bit. And then I like this from Jesus. In John 13, 34 and 35, He says, so now I am giving you a new commandment. Love each other just as I have loved you. You should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. Again, so many times we think it's going to be so many other things that proves to God who we are, or proves to the world, who we are. It's the how good is this that we're doing? How good is this program? And God says, you know what? It's not any of that. God says, if you want people to know that you are my disciples, all you need to do is love one another like I've loved you. Now, that's a big ask. It's a huge ask. It means being willing to die for one another. to sacrifice ourselves for another person that's sitting in this congregation. So it's really that simple. Show the supernatural love of Jesus to each other and the people of this world, and that's all you'll need to prove that you're His church. It's kind of an interesting, that you're His disciples. Let me put it that way. It doesn't matter what your services look like sometimes. It's not going to matter about all these crazy things that we argue about sometimes. If we cannot get the very simplest form of what God has commanded us to do, then nothing else matters. So my question then is, what if? What if we got as motivated and as upset and as passionate about evangelism and soul winning as we do as so many of the things we see going on in the world today? What if we got as upset about some of our dying churches, or the fact that the church in itself is dying, as we do some of our traditions, some of which, if we changed, we'd walk out of the building on for? This is the one that hit me a little bit. What if instead of having 30-minute conversations about physical things and having long, passionate discussions around these things, what if we had long, passionate discussions and conversations about the very fact that if you look at our congregation this year, we have had more people die than have been baptized? What if we got passionate and had long conversations about that? What if we stopped being so critical of others and gossiping about others? What if we stopped acting like we have all the answers and know everything? What if we stopped sitting on the sidelines? You know, we sung the song, Standing on the Promises. Dad talks about the people who stand on the premises, right? What if we put our passion around worship of politicians and politics and sports and our businesses and our jobs and our money and our religion? What if we took that same passion and put it into the simple message of Jesus? Because here's the truth, and here's the plain, simple side of it. If we don't get back to the simple message of Jesus, Him crucified, His love, and His grace, and what that means for us, it's not going to matter how good our programs are. It's not going to matter how big of buildings we build. It's not going to matter how good our social media and live stream is, or how much truth that we think we know sometimes. If we don't get back to the simple message of Jesus, none of these things really matter. And so my question then, and maybe it's a silly question, are you ready to be simple? Are you ready to strip a lot of the distractions and the things that we've brought in sometimes and stacked on top of the message of Christ? Are you ready to strip not all of that away, and just go back to focusing on Jesus and what He called and commanded us to do and to be? Because if not, I'm going to be honest with you, sometimes, if not, then I think a lot of times we're wasting our time. I think we're checking boxes, and none of those are what's going to get in you heaven. And I thought about a conversation of when we get to heaven. And I wonder sometimes if I thought of 3 questions, because there's 3 kind of main commands that pop out in my head whenever I'm thinking about the commands of Jesus and me standing before Him. And I think of 3 things He might ask. And the first one was, did you love me like I asked you to? And sometimes I wonder if I want to say, well, no, but, I was at every service, and I made sure I had this, was in charge of this program, and I made sure we had the best live stream, and I made sure we had the best presentations. But that's not the question He asked. And he's going to ask, well, did you make disciples like I asked you to? Well, no, I just wasn't really comfortable doing that. I really wasn't comfortable talking to people about Jesus. Or that's really the preacher's job anyways, or the elders. Did you love others like I asked you to? That was second to last commandment. Did you love others like I loved them? I'm going to say, no, people are mean, they're horrible. I don't, they're sinful. They're dirty. But I was nice to the ones who were nice to me. All right? I love the ones who love me back. And so that's my question. Is are you ready to just go back to the simple side of the gospel? Because I think in a lot of ways we've lost it. I think we've lost the simplicity of Christ and who he was. And I think we've stacked a lot of things on top of him that we use to try to, I don't know what the exact phrasing I want to use there, but we've just kind of stacked it and made it complicated. And again, I'm not saying that all these things that we do, having buildings and all those things are bad. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying we should shut it all down and go back to meeting in the houses and doing that kind of stuff. But what I'm saying is we need to make sure that what we do have going on and what we are using as Christians, we've got to make sure that those don't become distractions to what our main purpose is, and that it is to bring the lost to Christ. And so that's my question tonight. That's my statement of just being simple. Because I really do think that if you look at Christianity and the way God designed it, it was designed to be a simple thing, not an easy thing. He talks about love and sacrifice and loving loving your enemies and taking up crosses and willing to die to self. It's not easy, but I do think he made it pretty simple. And as humans, we've made it complicated. And so that's my question tonight, then. For those of you, I think most people in this room are Christians, but if not, are you ready to take that step toward the simplicity of Christ? And for those who may be like me, because I'll admit it, kind of gotten lost and made things complicated, made them more complicated than they need to be. Got caught up in the stuff we're doing rather than who we're doing it for. So whether you would like to bring yourself to Christ or you would just like to come forward because you have something, let's do that now while we stand and sing.